Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. What if the Great Lakes never existed? Hey guys, I don't know how many non-North Americans are really going to be interested in watching this with me, but I am very interested, so I'm going to react to it. Preemptive like, Alternate History Hub, great channel. My name's Connor if you're new. I am from right there, and I like to learn things, so join me. Let's go. What was that?
Geography determines history. Europe's natural access to the sea set the stage for it to create colonies across.
The Ottomans did that, didn't they? Isn't it strange how the rise of the Ottoman Empire and the fall of the Byzantine Empire was so close to the discovering of America in 1492? Of course, you can say the Vikings, Leif Erikson did that, but not in any real lasting affected way, I don't think. But so is that true that the Ottoman Empire caused, because now the Europeans couldn't get their goods from South Asia and East Asia, that they now had to try some new different things
Across the globe. The flat plains of Eurasia allowed the Mongols to carve up the largest land empire ever seen. In Florida's humid climate, created,
Taking the last bit of beer? Are you taking the last bit?
Florida.
Classic
The Great Lakes
Florida.
are not just simply lakes. They're more like a series of inland seas. If you grew up far away from the Midwest, you've probably never given them much thought. But being a Buckeye, I have. By all accounts, I am landlocked, hundreds of miles from the closest ocean. Yet, because of these lakes, it doesn't really feel that way. It really is a fourth coast on America's northern border. And for you Canadians, well, you already know how essential these lakes are. There's almost an uncanniness when removing the lakes from the map.
True.
North America appears off.
Actually, I kind of like it. What am I saying?
Empty. It becomes an unbroken mass of land. So I thought, what if this cursed image was actually reality? What if in an alternate timeline, the Great Lakes never existed at all?
I'm sure that, well, Europeans would have had a tougher time pushing westward.
Seems kinda simple to predict, right? Something that I might have gotten done quick before VidCon. Boy, was I wrong.
So how happened?
During the last ice age, the glaciers that dominated North America covered the land. When the glaciers retreated and melted, the water went into these lower elevated areas.
I'm pausing a lot, just, all right. I was confused as to how glaciers carved up things, right? But because my mind thinks it worked like this, which it didn't. But my understanding is that the glaciers carved things going southward. So glaciers would slide south and cut giant canyons in, but it would also melt over time, and so they would retreat. And my mind used to think it somehow the retreating glaciers is what carved it, but that doesn't make any sense, because why would the glaciers move up, not northward, but upward? But it was actually that they keep sliding downward. Ah, my God, I might sound like an idiot.
And melted, the water went into these lower elevated areas, creating the lakes we know and love today. And for a time, some that we didn't know until recently. Eek. In this alternate timeline, well, the glaciers just don't go as far south. Now this certainly has larger ramifications, because the only way the glaciers don't come farther south is if the Earth isn't as cold, and also this changes global ocean levels. However, let's just say they don't. Alright, get that out of your head. Well, what now?
Terrence Phillip, the Shield, Canadian Shield.
Common
a lot
sense
of lakes.
dictates I would talk about how the Native Americans would have been affected first, but I think the best way to explain all of this is to start with European colonization. The English may have colonized the East Coast, but the French were the ones who got a head start in upper North America. Instead of landing on the shores of Massachusetts, they decided to settle in the far north, exploring the Gulf of St. Lawrence in 1534 and using the river of the same name as a natural highway right into the interior of the continent. In an age before railways, rivers and oceans were
Come on, internet. You got this. I believe in you. Okay, sorry. Fixed it.
easiest, safest, and fastest way to transport anything across long distances. It was the St. Lawrence River, along with the Great Lake region, that gave life to the French colonial effort. This wasn't like the English in the 13 colonies. In true French manner, there were few actual colonists, because the French didn't like leaving France, but they did like money. The Great Lakes region was a gold mine for New France. The outposts and cities they created along this river,
Quebec.
like Quebec City and Montreal, were more than anything bases for a trading empire spanning the waterways of North America. This map is where they actually colonized. In an alternate timeline, without the Great Lakes,
I'm sort of close to Montreal. It's like a 12-hour drive,
there
but
is no St. Lawrence River. The river flows from Lake Ontario into the Atlantic, so no lakes, no river. That highway for France into the continent never exists. Any operations would have to set up base along the coastline instead, and maybe encourage some ships to sail further south. Since France and England began colonizing these regions around the same time, this alternate race now becomes a close competition over neighboring land, as France tries to stake claim in what we'd think of as Massachusetts and Maine before there is a Massachusetts or Maine.
woodpecker holes?
Massachusetts and Maine before there is a Massachusetts or Maine. Would war between France and Britain spark far earlier than in our own timeline? Well, no. Before the 7 Years' War, North America saw multiple wars and skirmishes between the two colonial powers over land that never erupted into a larger global war. It was common
7 Years'
belief
War.
that colonial wars were meant to be handled by the colonists themselves. With the two being literal neighbors, these conflicts are far more frequent and would have to end in a decisive winner, starting in the 17th century. New France, even with Quebec in our timeline, just didn't have the population on North America to outcompete the English. Long story short, the English very early on could simply outpopulate the French traders. Their colonies in the region are absorbed, and their short experiment in New England is remembered just as well as the Dutch with New Amsterdam or the Swedish. All of this occurring potentially a century before the 7 Years' War of our own timeline, meaning that, well... Yes, I know the French and Indian War was a theater in the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War saw the first fighting in North America, when France and England skirmished over the Ohio country. But the skirmish lasted 2 full years before it expanded into Europe. This conflict was different, simply because of the European politics at the time. Britain worried France would use the colonial disputes to attack their own holdings in Hanover, so they made an alliance with Prussia. France, fearing Prussia, allied with Austria, and bing bang boom, doesn't this look familiar? If France never had the opportunity to carve up so much of North America, there never is a vast colonial conflict that escalates into a similar European war during this exact time.
Interesting.
By the time the 1750s came around, if there actually was still some 7 Years' War, which I doubt there would be, Britain wouldn't have gained such vast amounts of territory in such a short period of time.
I feel like that's like saying if Gavrilo Princip never assassinated Franz Ferdinand, then there wouldn't be a World War I, which I just don't believe. I feel like that was the catalyst to a war that was already kind of building up for decades, maybe, if not at least years. So maybe it's not a great comparison, but I don't think that the killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the cause of World War I. I think it just happened to be the final straw, you know?
Because
Is that a bad comparison?
in such vast amounts of territory in such a short period of time, because there is no French land to take. And this is why this scenario has taken so long. The butterfly effect in action. There still is European wars, but there isn't the 7
the hell
years
is
war
that?
we in action.
Oh, I thought that was a leg. Is that its proboscis? It's actually pretty cool. Okay.
There still is European wars, but there isn't the 7 Years' War that we know. Meaning Britain doesn't find itself in debt after the conflict, they don't raise taxes on their own citizens,
And so no America?
and especially on the colonists who Parliament felt the war most benefited. Not only
Even if you don't agree that, you know, a lot of this stuff would have definitely been prevented, it is really cool when it comes to alternate history videos like this to think about how many things are interconnected. So
is there no higher taxes, there is no proclamation line created to stop colonial expansion into North America, since Britain wouldn't worry about another costly war if there never was one. The only people they'd wage war on are the natives. There are no French colonists, except perhaps in Louisiana.
Spanish?
The existence of New France created the unique situation that brought the global powers into war. A war that Britain did win, but ultimately would lose one of their greatest holdings, the 13 colonies.
hey, I'm from one of those.
Without the existence of the Great Lakes, there is never an American Revolution. So that said, I get that removing the 7 Years' War and American Revolution has dramatic effects on, well, everything. This means we see no France falling into revolution, no Napoleon, no sudden destruction of the Holy Roman Empire, and the rise of modern Germany.
Otto.
But I just want to focus on the North,
There he is, guys.
the Holy Roman Empire, and the rise of modern Germany.
Such a legend. Otto von Bismarck, legend.
But I just want to focus on the North American perspective. In our timeline after the Revolution, it's no surprise that the first colonists moving west went into the Great Lakes region. Like I said, natural highways, but also prime lakeshore real estate that allowed them to build their own cities like
Free
New
real
York
estate.
and Boston, but on the interior of the continent. In our timeline, the Erie Canal allowed for a ship to come from the Atlantic through the rivers of New England and into the lakes, allowing places like Chicago and Detroit to become linked trading cities. Let's go into this alternate turn of the century, 1800. What would North America
Guys, you could also, if you like, this is the thing about alternate history videos is no one can predict really what would happen. And even, you know, the makers of these alternate history videos, they know that, but it's still fun to theorize. But if you were to get rid of the Great Lakes, you also have to think about how that would drastically affect the population of Native Americans in the area, because it would probably switch to a similar population density as there were in the Great Plains, which was much less. And so you also have to count in, you don't have to, but you could also count in the fact that there would also be much less natives to resist your pushing westward than there were. Because I'd imagine that the Great Lakes had a large effect in boosting the population of natives as well.
look like, at least to the English colonists? To their west is a vast mountain range, which, while difficult to cross, is nothing too tremendous. But past that is an endless sea of woodland. They would vary, of course, by climate, changing more into a boreal sparse forest going into the Canadian Shield, hampering expansion into the continent. By this time, a river is still extremely valuable, so while it isn't impossible to take wagons and go deep into the continent, it wouldn't be very wise. Winters are extremely dangerous, go too far from a natural waterway, and it might take weeks to months to get back and resupply or get help. Without the lakes, the climate would remain relatively the same. The main difference is that there is no lake effect
snow.
or such extreme amounts of snow during the winter. Apart from that, the climate isn't drastically changed. British colonists expanding west would only do so through natural rivers, Alright, so what is this vital river then? Originally I was thinking
Ohio?
perhaps the Ohio River would become
Missouri?
the major lifeblood for the Midwest. However, upon research, I realized that the Ohio River actually wouldn't exist. The Ohio River was formed by the same glaciers that formed the lakes, and if we want to remain consistent, this river just doesn't exist.
Okay, but also if you want to remain consistent, then you have to think about the lakes, or about the rivers that would have been formed by the theoretical higher up glaciers in this timeline. So I'm not saying you have to account for everything, but if he's saying that he can't count the Ohio River now because it didn't exist, well, then you have to think about the different rivers that would exist because of the theoretical glaciers that would have been there at the time. But you can't really, unless you went super deep into like elevation changes, if that not happened, you can't really predict where the rivers would be.
The glaciers created, they also destroyed. I want to introduce to you the ancient pre-glacial Taos River, a series of waterways perfect for not only defense, but agriculture and settlement. This Taos system, while perfect real estate for colonists, would have been the main home for a vast population of native tribes. So this is the reason I haven't talked about natives in this region till now. Natives of the northern eastern woodlands were split uniquely by the geography of the lakes. Without the lakes, that identity and way of life is entirely shattered. The native population would have settled south, primarily living in this alternate river system, probably having the same style of living as the Mississippian cultures. Don't expect nations like the Iroquois Confederacy or tribes like the Miami, Erie, or Ottawa to remain the same. This is an entirely different cultural region of tribes with entirely different ways of life. This is where the first settlements would arrive. This river is thought to have connected to the Illinois, which connected to the Mississippi. So for the most part, it creates a core area of what Britain would want to colonize. This river becomes the dividing line for many colonies/states, just as the Mississippi is of our timeline. So it certainly creates a wonky look to the settlements. As colonization continues and natives are pushed out, the general population of European colonists is shifted south. There is, unsurprisingly, no Canada, and so the vast north is mainly populated by natives. Even in what we'd think of as today Toronto, something by now easily as crazy could have occurred as a result of Napoleon never rising. Maybe the fate of this alternate Europe is dominated by Austria, who knows? Without the 7 Years' War, this becomes a greater butterfly effect, considering France still would hold on to the Louisiana territory, and France certainly doesn't just hand it to the British. So I'm not going to talk about colonists moving past the Mississippi for this video, or the eventual colonization of the West. There's so much already, but there is one important event I think we need to talk about: the eventual rift that might be caused between colonist and home country: slavery. By the 19th century, it was pretty easy for Britain to make slavery illegal. The main slave colonies were in the Caribbean and not much else. They didn't need to worry about a slave power contesting their decision because the institution simply didn't have the population. However, in this alternate timeline, the South is still in the British Empire. Well, that complicates things, doesn't it? What's even more complicated is Britain financially compensated the slave-owning families for their losses. The payment put the empire in so much debt, it was not finally repaid until 2015. I think if the colonies still remained a part of Britain, it would be this looming issue that creates new resentment among the colonial public against Parliament across the sea. Even with talk of compensation, I think the public, with the culture and profits to be gained by the early 19th century, would be angered by the thought of abolition.
The revolution would be a few
about how
decades
such
on.
Decisions are being made by a faraway, corrupt parliament. Sound familiar? A declaration.
Common sense. Who created that again? Thomas? I forget his name.
By a faraway, corrupt parliament.
Henry.
Sound familiar?
Thomas Henry?
A declaration of independence from the British Empire in this case would be to protect the institution of slavery.
Interesting.
Whenever that would be. The Patriots are based
True, actually. Because it's likely that the American Revolution would be not happen or at least delayed. And then the issue with slavery, which Britain was earlier than the Union in our timeline in trying to get rid of it, then this would have happened. But now it would be the South against the North and Britain. So
basically alternate Confederates, and the Loyalists are either abolitionists, New Englanders, or rural folk who somehow survived in the forests of Canada.
me.
This revolution is a strange, complex affair. It easily could be an event that would get out of hand extremely fast and maybe even go global. Rivals such as France might take advantage of Britain's bad situation, maybe aid the rebels, especially since they're so close to French territory, assuming France didn't give it up. Whether the South wins or not, it doesn't matter because there is never that identity of the original 13 colonies.
well, if the Napoleonic Wars didn't happen, then how would they sell it?
It doesn't matter because there is never that identity of the original 13 colonies. There is no sense of national identity across all states because the revolution is actually a civil war. Even if the South loses, that association with splitting from Britain, say like Canada and Australia did in our timeline, would still bring back memories of the rebellion. And if the South did win, the North would want to remain extremely tied to Britain for potential protection. This isn't even going into how cotton fueled the Industrial Revolution and what this does to the modern world, but you know what? I can't go on forever and this timeline is simply getting out of control, so let's wrap this up.
Wait, so maybe the revolution would have happened, but rather than cutting off at like where modern day Canada is now between, you know, pro-Britain and pro-America in the end, pro-revolution, then maybe it just would have started more south. That's really interesting.
In my mind, alternate history isn't simply about the theorizing. It's about putting a specific event or person in context.
Absolutely.
Show how something small, big, or unimportant in history actually dramatically shaped our very identities in the world. Geography, unsurprisingly, shapes a lot of things, but the Great Lakes just existing entirely transformed the colonization of North America. It created boundaries which shaped eventual political alliances which turned into important wars, and down the line, how nations were formed. Even if you're not American or Canadian, these lakes, half a world away, ended up contributing to perhaps your legal code, the creation of your nation, or events that shaped an important time in global history. Certain events in history don't just occur in a bubble, it's all connected, and so one small change can affect all of us. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
I absolutely agree. Great video, by the way. I absolutely agree with him that it's not really about alternate history videos. It's not really just about whether they're completely like correct or feasible. It's about just showing you how nothing in our timeline or in the future is guaranteed, and it's affected by a lot of different things that you might not think are even important. Very interesting video. Love y'all. Would appreciate any comments down below. If I said anything you disagree with, answer any of my questions. You guys are always great with that. See you guys next time. Bye.